Yes, thanks, Dilek. Very conveniently, you actually introduced my my presentation as well, so I'll be quicker than I thought. I'm Fabrizio. I work at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors in the thought leadership team, and I was a member of the technical expert group, which essentially provided the draft of the taxonomy to the European Commission. So I will be going through essentially how the criteria have been formulated, the kind of rationale that's beyond that, and what I think are the challenges in there. And as I said, Dilek, you have already introduced this topic, so I'm not going to go through why we need the taxonomy and how taxonomy essentially works. I think that the benefits of how the taxonomy has been formulated for buildings is that it does have a strong focus on renovation, and it does cover virtually all building types. And it does encourage the development of dedicated financial products, such as the energy efficient mortgage label, which I invite you to know more about. But I will get into the meat of the presentation now. As we know, the taxonomy covers building-related activities under the substantial contribution to climate change mitigation, which is what I will focus on today. Climate change adaptation has also been covered with a much more qualitative type of criteria, I would say. What I will focus on is the three main building-related activities: construction of new buildings, renovation, and acquisition and ownership. As you know, there's individual measures there, professional services. Those are effectively a list of things that are eligible, so it is fairly straightforward how this should be interpreted. First thing I want to say is to draw your attention that the taxonomy works by looking at economic activities, and buildings by themselves are not economic activities. So the first challenge was to how do we address building performance through the medium of a building-related activity? Now, the substantial contribution thresholds and the criteria that are used in taxonomy, they're essentially based on EU policy. So the NZ policies, the EPC ratings, as the major renovation has defined by the Energy Performance Building Directive. Next to those are the minimum standards that are introduced for the do no significant harm for the other 5 environmental objectives. And those are meant to be, in a sense, to a lower level of environmental contribution, obviously, than the substantial contribution. Plus, there's the minimum social safeguards, which I'm not going to cover here. Now, this table is just to show you that there has been a change between what was initially proposed by the technical expert group in 2020, and then was effectively what was enshrined in the regulation in April 2021. And the main changes were for the new construction criteria and for the acquisition and ownership of buildings built before 2020. So the Commission did go and change and adapt some of the criteria that were prepared by and proposed by the technical expert group. And now it's maybe the question is, did the Commission do it well or with sufficient rationale? And I think in some cases, this is quite questionable. So in order to talk about the taxonomy principles, criteria, I will be using the compass, which is this little tool that was provided by the European Commission online. I think it's much easier to look at them here rather than looking at the annex document, which is not very user-friendly. As you can see, all the construction activities have been summarized here, as well as together the other activities. So this is very useful to kind of go through the criteria. As we look at the construction of new buildings, which is obviously very important, you can see that they summarize here the adaptation criteria and the climate mitigation criteria. These are the do no significant harm criteria, which we'll look at it very quickly, but then the main criteria are under here, the substantial contribution. So this is when a new construction is aligned with taxonomy. And the main criteria is to have the primary energy demand of the building at least 10% lower than the threshold that's set for the nearly zero energy building requirement that is applicable for that building. And then for larger buildings, there are 2 additional requirements. One is to undergo a testing for airtightness and thermal integrity, as well as to effectively conduct a embodied carbon assessment and to make that available on demand. And those two are fairly straightforward. The main meat is here, obviously, is having a building which is 10% better than the relevant NZ. And the rationale for this, I think, needs to be explained, because this type of criteria generated quite some debate around, but I think the rationale is very strong here. The idea is that NZ regulation is now mandatory in Europe. So any new building, by definition, has to comply with the NZ regulation. So it makes sense for the taxonomy to ask for more, because if it didn't ask for more, if any NZ building was eligible, then any new construction would be eligible. And that would, defy the purpose of the taxonomy, where a new construction is happening. If it's happening, is in most cases because there is a developer behind it that sees a business case. So the construction would be happening anyway. And in order for the developer to get access to green finance, it makes sense that they would do more than what they are required to do by a regulation. And I think that clarifies why this 10% lower is there. Now, we initially proposed 20%, and the Commission brought it down to 10%. I think this was a compromise that maybe wasn't needed. The idea is that that percentage would increase over time, so that we effectively get to a net zero energy building rather than a nearly zero energy building. So if I can then move on to the next activity, which is the renovation of existing building, you see that the approach here is very different. For the substantial contribution criteria, is that the building renovation complies with the requirements that are set out in a major renovation as defined in the EPBD directive. And this is because we do know, as Dilek said, that the renovation rates are very, very low in Europe. They need to be massively increased in order to decarbonize. And so we wanted to make it easy for people who are going to pay for the renovation, which in a lot of cases is just private households, to comply with the taxonomy. So if they are doing a renovation, then it's already kind of likely that they will be doing it according to the major renovation requirements, which are essentially enshrined in building regulation at each national level. And so it's easy to be taxonomy compliant. And this is very different from the new construction. From the new construction, we do want to kind of put a brake on things, while here we do want to accelerate things. So that's why it's so straightforward in a sense, because renovation wouldn't happen by themselves, not just like new construction. We do need to push for that and to make to allow households to renovate their houses. Now, in alternative, you can also comply by reducing primary energy ban by 30%. And this is to give an alternative where, in cases where the major renovation might be a problem or might not be easy to do. And so that's why we have this 30%. And this also makes it applicable outside of Europe, which I think is very, very important. If we then go into the other activity that we have here, is the acquisition and ownership of buildings, which again is a particular way to looking at things. Effectively, when the building is owned and managed, how do you make it sustainable in a sense? So in terms of the substantial contribution criteria, what the buildings have been divided in two types: those built before 2020 and those built after 2020. And for both of them, when the building is large and non-residential, it needs to be effectively, efficiently operated. And this can be demonstrated in a number of ways. But the key point here is that for buildings that are built after 2020, so from now on, effectively, you need to meet the criteria specified in section 7.1. And this is just the new construction section. So if something is eligible under new construction, i.e. it's 10% better than NZEB, then it's also eligible for acquisition and ownership. Instead, for all the buildings, the challenge was, how do we make a part of the market, obviously the top part of the market, eligible, but how do we make this fair across European countries? And what the compromise that's been done here is to have a request for a list EPC class A. And as an alternative, the building is within the top 15% of the national regional building stock in terms of primary energy demand. This is because it's very clear to us that the EPC is not really fair to use EPCs across countries because they've been defined very differently. In one countries, you might have maybe 20% of the building stock, which is EPC class A. In another country, you might have 3%. So that's not fair, and it doesn't make a level playing field across. So that's why we do want to have an alternative way, which is to say the top 15% of the market is eligible. Now, this is fair, and because by definition, in every market, 15% of the market is eligible. The issue here is how do you demonstrate that? Now, in some markets, it's easier when there's more data. In other markets, it's less easy, but at least it's doable. Now, what I want to show you maybe is that the key point here is, apologies, I thought I had this. The key point here is to have not only you to be aligned with taxonomy, you need to be aligned with the substantial contribution criteria to climate mitigation, but also to the do no significant harm criteria. And those are kind of aligned across the various activities. So maybe I'll show you here the ones that are for new buildings, which are the stricter ones. And we can then, you can look at the other ones and see that how they've been adapted, but they're fairly similar across the various building activities. Now, this means that you do not only have, for example, as we said, be 10% better than Z, but you also have to comply with these things. Now, for climate adaptation, the activity needs to comply with what has been set out in this appendix, which is a long description of how the activities, what the activities must do. I think this has honestly been a mistake on the side of the Commission. The issue is, how do I actually verify this, that I comply with this? I don't think it is clear at all. I don't think it is easy at all. I think this is going to be a problem. Differently with water, with what we propose is effectively to have a very specific performance levels for the appliances that are installed. And it might be a problem understanding what type of appliances have been installed, how do you verify this, but this list is a very yes/no threshold. You either comply or you don't comply. Now, there's also this additional criteria, which is set out in this other appendix, which is essentially about doing an environmental impact assessment, which is okay, I think. Now, in circular economy, what the technical expert group proposes to have at least 70% of the waste being managed effectively according to the EU demolition waste management protocol. This is already in line with European policy and regulation, so this is not a problem. What is a problem, in my opinion, is the second criteria here that was added by the Commission that says that building design and construction techniques need to support circularity with reference to the standard or other standards, assessing disassembly, adaptability of buildings, how they are designed to be more efficient. Well, this is not a yes or no threshold, so I'm not sure how people are going to be able to certify that they meet this criteria. Differently with pollution prevention, most of these things are effectively things that are based on very specific regulation requirement. And if you are in Europe and you're building in Europe, then it's most likely that your building products will already be compliant with European policies, so there's not an issue. What I see as an issue is the last bit that was added here, as measures are taken on the construction side to reduce noise. Well, how much reduction, what type of measure is not specified, so I'm not sure how people are going to go and certify this. And finally, biodiversity, there's again some other criteria, is essentially not building on areas that are biodiversity. Now, we had a requirement in the TEG proposal to use wood that was, or at least a percentage of wood that was FSC certified. And this was removed, and I think it was a mistake because that was a fairly easy way to certify that your materials are sustainable and not impacting on biodiversity. Now, to conclude, I think we can say something about the challenges that we see for the taxonomy use. One thing is understanding what is eligible as a taxonomy aligned, particularly for buildings and kind of the mortgage environment is important. Is it just investment or the asset value as well? This is not clear yet to stakeholders. The next challenge is essentially how do we verify and measure those qualitative do no significant harm criteria? How do we do the same, verify and measure the substantial contribution to climate adaptation where it is kind of subject to a subjective evaluation? But then another challenge is typical of the sectors, data availability and access. And then finally, something that I think it really needs to be addressed somehow is how do we use the taxonomy outside EU member states, because those, you might have assets that are outside the EU that are part of financial instruments that are marketed within the EU, and these are particularly relevant for new construction. But in terms of what's next, I just invite you to follow the works of the Sustainable Finance Platform, which, as you might know, is effectively the successor of the Technical Expert Group. They're the ones that are developing the criteria for the 4 remaining environmental objectives, the ones developing the social taxonomy, and the ones that are also looking to produce documentation in terms of usability and taxonomy and clarifying how it's meant to be used. So that's it for me. Thanks very much. I give the floor back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fabrizio, for your presentation. Actually, in terms of opportunities, I believe it is quite clear for all of us how we can contribute a better environment, sustainable environment, and also decarbonization. But thank you point out the challenges which requires time to just think about, and also just include to regulations, and then companies and the investors can easily follow and then just make themselves taxonomy aligned. Actually, we just received a few questions. You already give some answers. One of them, one of the question: what if a building cannot be renovated? But I assume you already replied that just putting this 10% energy efficiency, right?
Sorry, I think. I guess what if a building cannot be renovated? Yes. So well, if it doesn't make sense to renovate it in terms of its lifespan, then I guess that it just doesn't make sense. What is an alternative way is that there are those individual measures that are also eligible. So instead of doing the whole renovation, you might be eligible to get some specific measures such as boiler replacement, which might address, the problem for like the last 10 years of the lifespan of the building. But yeah. And then I think I just want to address the last questions there, which is, are there alternative routes to compliance beyond EPCs? Such as through green building standards. Now, we had envisioned this in the proposal of the TEG, and I think that was taken out in the last version of the taxonomy by the Commission. I think, again, that is probably a mistake, because although it's hard to compare green building certificates, how do you say what is a decent level of eligibility? Our solution was to say, well, it's up to the scheme provider, essentially, so such as BRE or LEED, to come to the taxonomy and to the Commission and to say, look, this level of building certificates is comparable to what you require in the taxonomy, so it can be used as a proxy. And I think this should have been left in the taxonomy. It added a flexibility, and it added a way to comply outside European member states. Hopefully, maybe in the future, will be introduced again. I'm not sure. The one last thing that I wanted to say is that we need to consider that the taxonomy can't be expected to solve all the problems. A lot of the feedback that we received when the taxonomy was being developed seemed to think that people were putting so much expectation and so much power on what the taxonomy is. Well, it can't be that. It cannot replace building regulation. It cannot replace policy intervention and funding, direct funding for certain things. It can do what it's meant to be doing, you know, with this, which is within the finance sector, try to address, okay, what is an acceptable level of sustainability for each of the environmental objectives.
Okay, thank you so much. Just sharing all your experts and contribution for today. I guess at the end also we will just cover if you have a point you already mentioned, but we can cover all together with all the panelists, and then just so we can wrap up this panel.